stillness of late night has a way of settling over everything, like a thick blanket of quiet. I've always liked the peace it brings, the way the world seems to go on pause, leaving me alone with my thoughts. But that night, something was different. I wasn't at peace. There was a tension in the air, something I couldn't quite place, as though I wasn't alone. I shrugged it off at first, blaming it on the cold October breeze that rattled the trees outside my window. But the unease grew stronger, clawing at the edges of my mind until it was impossible to ignore. I had just finished cleaning up from a late dinner and was settling into the couch with a cup of tea when I heard something. Barely a sound, more like a faint rustle from outside. I paused, listening carefully, but all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I chalked it up to the wind and went back to sipping my tea, though the unsettling feeling lingered. As I stared absently at the TV, I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right. I felt it deep in my gut, a tight, uncomfortable knot. My eyes drifted toward the window at the far side of the room, the curtains swaying slightly in the breeze from the heating vent. Something compelled me to get up and check. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just a habit from living alone, the need to make sure everything was secure. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I stood up and crossed the room, pulling the curtains aside to peer out into the darkness. My backyard stretched out before me, bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. Nothing seemed out of place. The old wooden fence was intact, and the lawn was covered in a blanket of fallen leaves. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind stirring the branches of the oak tree in the far corner of the yard. But no, there it was again. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, barely visible in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was too far away, too shrouded in darkness. They weren't moving now, just standing there, motionless, watching. My heart began to race. Who the hell would be standing in my yard in the middle of the night? 1,000 possibilities rushed through my mind. An intruder, a neighbor playing a prank, or maybe just a lost drunk. But deep down, I knew it was none of those things. There was something off about this figure, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to get away, to hide. I stepped back from the window, my mind scrambling for a plan. Call the police? But what would I tell them? That someone was standing in my yard? They'd come out, look around, and probably tell me it was just a kid messing around or that I'd imagined it. I glanced at my phone sitting on the coffee table, but before I could reach for it, I heard another sound. This time, it wasn't a rustle. It was a faint scraping noise, like metal dragging against wood. My blood ran cold as I realized the sound was coming from the back door. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears. The scraping continued, low and deliberate, sending shivers down my spine. I reached the doorway and peered around the corner. The back door was still locked, the handle unmoved, but outside, through the glass, I could see it. The figure had moved closer, now standing just a few feet from the door. It was tall, unnervingly so, with long, spindly limbs that seemed too thin for its body. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The scraping sound came again, as one of its hands, pale and claw-like, dragged across the wooden frame of the door. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with fear. This wasn't a person. This wasn't some prank. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, the way it stood there, so still, yet so menacing. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, too calm for what was happening. I tried to explain, my voice shaking as I described the figure standing outside my door. She assured me that help was on the way, but I could tell she didn't understand. How could she? This wasn't the kind of thing you could explain to someone who wasn't there, who couldn't feel the oppressive weight of the figure's presence pressing down on you. I hung up the phone, my eyes darting back to the door. The figure hadn't moved, but I could sense its patience wearing thin. The scraping had stopped, and now there was just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Every second stretched out, filled with dread. I kept my eyes on the door, waiting for the police to arrive, hoping that the sound of sirens would scare the figure away. But the longer I waited, the more I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to be scared off by a couple of cops. Suddenly, the figure moved. It stepped forward, closer to the door, its face finally coming into the light. But there was no face, just a blank, featureless surface where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. My stomach churned with horror. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure raised one of its clawed hands and pressed it against the glass, leaving a dark, oily smear as it dragged its fingers down the surface. The sound was sickening, like nails on a chalkboard, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound of distant sirens broke the silence. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly as if listening. Then, without warning, it turned and melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The police arrived moments later, but there was nothing for them to find. No sign of the figure, no evidence that anything had been there at all. I never saw it again after that night, but the memory of its blank, staring face has haunted me ever since. I don't know what it was or why it came to my house, but I've learned one thing. When the night feels heavy, when the air is thick with silence, things are lurking in the dark that we were never meant to see. And sometimes they see us too. This story happened a few years ago, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread it left behind. Around 2 a.m., the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. I was driving back home after spending the evening at a friend's place. It wasn't unusual for me to be out late, but that night something felt wrong. The drive should have been uneventful. I live in a small town surrounded by rural roads, mostly deserted at that hour. The stretch of road I was on was familiar, a long, winding two-lane with fields on both sides, broken up by the occasional patch of woods. It's the kind of road that's pitch black at night, with only the moon and your headlights cutting through the darkness. The weather was clear, with no fog or rain, just the eerie silence that comes with driving alone at night. About halfway through my drive, I noticed something odd. Far off in the distance, there was another car. At first, I was relieved to see someone else on the road, but as I got closer, I realized this car wasn't moving. It was parked on the side of the road, hazards blinking faintly. I slowed down out of instinct, thinking maybe they needed help. But as I approached, I noticed no one was inside. The windows were rolled down, and the interior lights were off, as if someone had just stepped out. Something about the car made me uneasy, and my gut was telling me to keep driving. I glanced over as I passed, but still, nothing. No sign of the driver. The fields on either side of the road were empty, and there was no nearby house or building where someone could have gone. It didn't make sense. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the person had walked for help or they were in the woods for some reason. But as I continued driving, that eerie feeling only grew stronger. A few miles down the road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. Headlights. The car behind me was gaining speed, fast. I felt my pulse quicken as the headlights grew brighter and brighter until they were practically blinding me through the mirror. At first, I thought it was just some reckless driver or someone in a hurry to get home, but the way they were tailgating me, almost bumper to bumper, set off alarms in my head. I switched lanes to let them pass, but they didn't. Instead, they followed my every move, sticking so close behind me that I could see the shadowy outline of the driver. I pressed down on the gas, my heart racing, trying to put distance between us. But no matter how fast I went, they matched my speed. My car was now flying down this narrow road, headlights illuminating the trees that whipped by on either side. I could feel sweat building on my palms, gripping the steering wheel tighter with every mile. Then, without warning, the headlights vanished. Just like that, they were gone. I slowed down, looking in every mirror, trying to figure out where the car had gone. I was on a straight stretch of road with nowhere to turn off. There were no exits, no side roads, just the endless expanse of dark fields. I was sure the car had been right behind me. How could it just disappear? For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I rounded a bend in the road, my blood ran cold. The car, the same car from earlier, the one I had seen parked on the side of the road, was there again. This time it was directly in front of me, stopped in the middle of the lane, hazards blinking slowly. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as I barely avoided crashing into it. My heart was pounding in my chest. Who the hell was doing this? I sat there staring at the car, expecting someone to step out, but no one did. I quickly reversed, trying to create some distance, but before I could turn around, my headlights caught something, movement on the side of the road. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, was slowly walking toward my car from the ditch. They were dressed in black, their face hidden in shadow, but their posture was unnerving, slow, deliberate, like they knew I was trapped. I threw the car into drive and swerved past the parked car, my tires spinning as I floored it. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of that figure getting closer, watching me escape, was enough to send a wave of panic through me. I drove until I reached the next town, not stopping until I pulled into a well-lit gas station. My hands were trembling as I parked. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to steady my breathing, waiting for the adrenaline to wear off. When I finally gathered the courage to get out and look around, I half expected to see that car parked nearby, or the figure watching from the shadows. But the lot was empty, and the only other vehicle there was a truck with a driver who was sound asleep inside. The police never found anything when I reported it. They told me it was probably a prank or someone who needed help, but I knew better. I could feel it in my bones. Whoever or whatever was out there that night wasn't playing a prank. I still take that same road sometimes, but I never drive it at night anymore. I don't think I ever will. It was the dead of night when I first noticed the shadows moving. I'd always been a night owl, staying up late to watch movies, read, or scroll mindlessly through my phone, but something about that night felt different. It wasn't anything I could explain at first, just an odd tension in the air, like the darkness itself was holding its breath. I was in my living room, the dim light from the TV flickering across the walls as I half-watched a horror movie. The sound was down low, and the house was almost entirely silent. My house sat at the edge of town, and I'd always loved the isolation it provided. No noisy neighbors, no traffic sounds, just quiet. But on that night, the silence was oppressive. It felt as though the house was trying to suffocate me. At around 2 a.m., I decided to take a break. I paused the movie, got up, and stretched. I glanced out the window as I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I saw something in the corner of my eye, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a flicker of movement in the shadows. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just a trick of the light, or maybe a stray animal wandering too close to the house. But as I stood there, staring out into the night, the movement continued. Something was there, shifting in the darkness. I stepped closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The trees in my backyard swayed slightly in the breeze, casting long, spindly shadows across the lawn. And that's when I saw it clearly, a figure standing motionless at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. A chill ran down my spine, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure wasn't moving now, just standing there, watching. I quickly turned off the kitchen light, hoping whoever it was hadn't seen me. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched by the window, peeking out from behind the curtains. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. I couldn't make out any details, but it was a person, tall and unnervingly still. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. It was Halloween season after all. Maybe some kid was messing around, trying to scare people. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. There was something wrong about the way the figure stood. Too rigid, too deliberate, like it was waiting for something. I pulled out my phone and hovered over the call button, ready to dial 911. But I hesitated. What would I even say? Someone is standing in my yard. It didn't seem like enough, and part of me didn't want to believe that this was happening. I decided to wait a few more minutes, hoping the figure would move on. But as the seconds ticked by, it remained rooted in place. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes, and a growing sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. Suddenly, the figure shifted. It took a step forward, then another, slowly moving into the dim light cast by my porch. My heart leaped into my throat. It was close now, close enough that I could make out more details. The figure was wearing dark clothing, nothing unusual, but its face was wrong. It wasn't a mask, but the features were distorted, as if someone had taken a human face and stretched it into something grotesque. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, the skin pale and waxy like a mannequin, and worst of all, it was smiling. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing. This wasn't a prank. This was something else, something far more sinister. I bolted into the living room and grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The call connected, and I quickly explained what was happening, my voice shaking as I described the figure standing outside my house. The dispatcher was calm, asking me if the person had tried to break in or if they had a weapon. I told them no, that the figure was just standing there watching. They assured me that officers were on their way, but it would take some time since I lived on the outskirts of town. I hung up the phone and stood in the middle of my living room, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't dare look out the window again, afraid of what I might see. Instead, I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I kept telling myself that it would be fine, that the police would get here, and the figure would be gone. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. My heart stopped. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone gently knocking, trying to get my attention. I forced myself to turn and look, and there, on the other side of the glass, was the figure's face, pressed against the window. That same grotesque, distorted smile, those wide, unnatural eyes. I stumbled back, unable to tear my gaze away. The figure didn't move, didn't try to break in. It just stared at me through the glass, smiling that awful, too wide smile. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands shaking as I backed away toward the hallway. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but I was too afraid to move. I was paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. Just as I was about to make a break for the back door, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were finally here. Relief washed over me, and I glanced back at the window. The figure was gone. The officers arrived within minutes, flashing their lights through my yard and searching the perimeter of the house. They didn't find anyone. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I tried to explain what I had seen, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They assured me that it was probably a prank, some kid trying to scare me, but I knew better. There was no way that thing, whatever it was human. After the police left, I sat in my living room, all the lights on, clutching the knife in my lap. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every shadow sent a fresh wave of terror through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. It's been weeks since that night, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the soft tapping on the window again, but I'm too scared to look. I know if I do, I'll see that smile, those eyes staring back at me. And this time, I don't think the police will be able to help.